1979, the worst year of the DeMeo crew, was that even with the bloody torrent preceding and including Dominic Rigucci and Chris Rosenberg, the year was less than half over. Bouncing back fast, Roy plunged down a bloody road. He picked Joey Testa to replace Chris as his new right hand. Not that he did not like equally capable Henry Borelli, but Roy felt a closer bond to Joey, a former apprentice butcher too, and now, like him, a professional. He fit the last pieces of his car deal together, but did not neglect other deals, all of which led him, and Nino, to yet more heinous murders, and one of them, finally, to jail. Henry was bitterly disappointed when Roy chose younger Joey over him, but Roy quickly sought to soothe his wounded feelings. While Joey and Anthony were given responsibility for moving all the stolen Cuban cocaine, Roy gave Henry a big job in the Kuwait stolen car operation. Without having to do a lot of work, Henry was made one of the deal's 5 active partners. The operation had been in abeyance several months, while another partner, a Long Island used car dealer, concocted a satisfactory scheme for shipping the cars under another man's freight forwarding company. The dealer was Ronald Ustica, a 34-year-old lifelong resident of Baldwin, Long Island, who met Roy while selling cars for another used car lot, whose owner was perpetually in debt to Roy's book. Ustica was mild-mannered, recently married, and had little in common with Roy and the crew except a larcenous heart. He and Roy came up with the scheme after he met 2 Arab importers who came to New York as partners to buy second-hand cars for resale in Kuwait. In discussions, Ustica discovered that one partner, Abdullah Hassan, had the same larcenous flaw as he. Encouraged by Roy, Ustica told the importers he could provide many quality used cars at $5,000 each if they did not mind that they were stolen. Sure, he could resell the cars for at least twice as much in Kuwait. Hassan did not mind. His partner, however, did, and they split up with the partner vowing to stay in New York and put his own legitimate deal together. Hassan returned to Kuwait to await the cars. As he had already indicated he would, Roy also brought Freddie into the deal, and because Freddie's stumblebum brother, Richie, had shown such ambition in the Joey Scorney murder, him also. Roy informed Freddie that a full 6th share of the profit would have to go to Nino, and the Hill, meaning Paul Castellano, whose new White House occupied a Staten Island knoll known as Toad Hill, toad meaning death in Dutch. Roy gave the active partners specific roles. Richie, aided by Vito Arena, at $100 per vehicle, would steal the cars. Freddie in his shop would replace the locks. Together, the brothers would make and install the phony VIN plates, using tool dies Roy had acquired and randomly chosen numbers that Roy would check with his cop pals to prevent the inadvertent invention of a hot VIN number. Henry would create the phony paperwork, a comparatively trifling worry now because a dealer's mere invoice, rather than a title, would be enough to ship the car overseas, which Ustica would oversee. "I want good cars," Ustica said to Freddie the first time Roy introduced them. "Cars with not much mileage on them, possibly velour interiors, and with electric windows and seats." Velour interiors were desirable, Roy explained, because the Arabs who would buy the cars from Hassan in Kuwait were opposed, for religious reasons, to sitting on leather. They were not opposed, however, to big cars with low gas mileage, because gasoline was so cheap in Kuwait. Richie and Vito were told to steal high-end General Motors cars like Chevrolet Caprices, Oldsmobile Regencies, and Buick Electras, preferably Caprices and preferably 4-door, because some were destined to become taxis. Beginning in June, Richie and Vito began cruising for cars each night. Unlike Peter LaFrocia and Willie Camp, who in their heyday drove around in a Jaguar, the Gemini thieves used Richie's homely station wagon, with its stroller, baby seat, and other infant paraphernalia. They began around midnight and usually swept through the predominantly Jewish neighborhood of Borough Park in Brooklyn because, as Vito explained, they would find, for religious reasons, fewer cars with leather seats made from pigskin. With Joey Scorney out of the way, Richie was finally able to demonstrate he could steal cars too. Bulky Vito was still mainly a getaway driver, but stole on occasion, though he still had difficulty squeezing beneath the dashboards of some cars. The cars were driven to flatlands and left, with the passenger side sun visor pulled down, on the streets near Freddie's shop. "There's 4 in the bush," Richie would say over the telephone to Freddie each morning, so Freddie and Henry would know, by the sun visors, which 4 cars to drive into Freddie's shop and begin working on. The shop only had room for 4 at a time. After the cars were outfitted with new identities, locks, and transporter plates from Ustica's dealership, they were driven to Nassau County and parked along the streets near his home in Baldwin, around the corner from a police station. Vito's boyfriend Joey Lee, Roy's cousin Joseph Guglielmo, and a few other fringe characters were paid a few dollars to drive the cars to Baldwin, where they sat until they were driven to Ustica's lot and taken by rented car carrier to Pier 292 in Newark, New Jersey, from which they were shipped to Al-Shwiaba, Kuwait. For the first few months, most everything went swimmingly. Freddie did gripe that Henry was hard to work with because he was always showing up late and complaining. In Kuwait, Abdullah Hassan griped that some cars were showing up without their radios, and Roy had to tell Freddie to stop stealing them. The partners, however, were each making $7,000 to $9,000 a week. Roy griped to Freddie they would be hauling in that much more if they did not have to pay auto crime unit cops Peter Calabro and John Dougherty $1,500 a week to check the VINs, and did not also have to cut in Nino and Waterhead. Real problems began early in September. Making his arrangements with Hassan, Ustica had failed to consider the persistence of Hassan's former partner, a Jordanian citizen named Khaled Fad Darwish Daoud. Daoud was a secretary in the chemistry department of the University of Kuwait when Hassan persuaded him they could make money importing cars. Daoud still believed and was trying to do it on his own, and had already written a letter home mentioning Ustica and complaining he was competing against thieves. That might have been the end of it if Daoud had not begun to notice that rarely were there any more Chevrolet Caprices available at the used car auctions in New Jersey, where new car dealers dumped trade-ins. Caprices were the cars he wanted most too. Out of curiosity, he stopped by Pier 292 in Newark and found the answer to this riddle. Dozens of Caprices lined up for shipment to Kuwait. The reason the dealers and auction lots had so few Caprices was that so many were here, undoubtedly hot. Daoud began writing down the dashboard VINs just as Ustica showed up. Daoud, a blunt-spoken, defiant man with no appreciation of the deadly nest he had disturbed, began arguing with Ustica and threatened to report him to the police. At an emergency session of the active Gemini Kuwait partners, Ustica reported Daoud's remarks to Roy. Of course, this was the same as signing the Jordanian's death warrant. "Then we'll have to kill him," Roy said to no one's surprise, including ambitious Richie and suddenly prosperous and ruthless Ustica. "He has to go and I'll pay for it," Ustica volunteered. Arguing with Daoud, Ustica had learned that Hassan's former partner was living at the Diplomat Hotel in Rockville Center in Nassau County, not far from the Gemini. Roy, Henry, Freddie, and Vito promptly staked it out, but discovered that Daoud's room was near the manager's office. That would not have thrown a wrinkle into the hit if, in an unusual oversight, Roy had not neglected to bring a gun equipped with a silencer and to remind the others. It was a sign that Roy, always the one to worry about armament before departing for work, was getting a bit forgetful as his bloodlust mounted. But then he was drinking a lot, late at night, in his house that was not a home. "4 guys walking in and shooting the guy, that's going to be noisy," Vito brilliantly observed, as they all regretted the mistake, sitting in Roy's car in the hotel parking lot. Roy dispatched Henry to telephone Richie DeNomi, who lived near the Diplomat Hotel, and tell him to bring the custom silencer Roy had awarded him upon his entry to the crew. Henry did, but an hour went by with no sign of Richie or the spanking new Joey Scorney-type Porsche Turbo Carrera he had purchased. Richie was also dressing like the late Scorney these days, very cool NYPD T-shirts and lots of gold chains under a dungaree jacket. Henry telephoned Richie's house again and learned that while attaching the silencer to a loaded weapon, Richie, burnishing his reputation for ineptitude, had shot himself in the left hand and was in a hospital. Not knowing how he might have explained away the wound, the assassins abandoned their plan for the time being. Making money off cocaine, indirectly or directly, Nino and Roy had been violating Paul's no-drugs policy and thus flirting with personal disaster for many years. So had several other soldiers and crews, including the one led by former Brownsville-Canarsie resident John Gotti, protege of Manhattan faction leader Agnello Della Croce. The profit in going off the record, as the practice was known, was too irresistible. Short of wiping out half of his family, Paul was unable to stop it. Now and then, however, to remind everyone of the rules, someone breaking them in an especially flamboyant way would be sent to the morgue. Late in September, Nino's and Roy's long flirtation with disaster came home to roost. It began with an intra-family accusation, not the arrest Nino and Roy had always feared. A bookmaker in Nino's crew, Jimmy Ippolito, told Paul that Nino and Roy had been going off the record a long time. Until lately, Ippolito had been the most influential of the elderly cigar chompers in the Bath Beach, Bensonhurst wing of Nino's crew, a feeble bunch compared to Roy. Because Paul was his former captain and because he was Sicilian and had been made by Carlo Gambino, the 65-year-old Ippolito was still technically Roy's immediate superior when Nino was away. In fact, in Carlo's day, his word alone would have sealed the accused's fate. But these were Paul's days now, and Jimmy's word and life were not worth as much. In a sign of the times, Ippolito was motivated by his son's off-the-record trouble. In a cocaine deal with Roy's crew, the son, a 34-year-old soldier also known as Jimmy, was swindled out of several $1,000s. Jimmy Jr. complained to his father, but Roy, and then Nino, accused Jimmy Jr. of lying and being a police informer. Dishonored, Jimmy Sr. went to Paul and made his accusations against Nino and Roy. He even asked for permission to kill them. His timing was not good. Paul was already angry at Jimmy Jr. because of his participation in a crooked children's charity that duped several celebrities, including the First Lady of the United States, Rosalind Carter, and United States Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts. What upset Paul most was that when the scam was uncovered on the CBS television program 60 Minutes, and newspapers published still photographs from the TV footage showing Jimmy Jr. had conned the First Lady into posing with him at one of the supposed charity's dinners. Paul feared that in retaliation, President Jimmy Carter might send another 1,000 FBI agents to New York with orders to smash the Gambino family. Jimmy Sr. also failed to appreciate the depth of Nino's relationship with Paul, who accepted Nino's version of events and ordered him to resolve the matter however he chose, a de facto death sentence for Jimmy Sr. and Jimmy Jr., given how Nino had previously approved and Roy previously carried out executions of closer associates who caused trouble. One day soon afterward, outside the Veterans and Friends, Dominic saw Roy pointedly refuse to shake Jimmy Sr.'s extended hand. He later mentioned it to Nino, who, without providing any background, told him to stop speaking to Jimmy Sr. The next day, again outside the Veterans and Friends, he saw Jimmy Sr. pacing and madly muttering to himself, I fucked up. Nino and Roy chose Monday, October 1st, as the day to resolve the matter, employing the Gemini method. Nino had always told Dominic that while he was usually opposed to dismemberment, sometimes it was necessary. This, he now decided, was one of those times. With Jimmy Sr. so keen about his future, however, Nino and Roy faced a tactical problem: how to get the old man and his son into voluntarily going to the Gemini charnel house. They found a solution in Peter Piacente, another aging soldier Paul had handed off to Nino. They duped Piacente into believing that a sit-down between the Ippolitos and Nino and Roy's crew was to be held at the Gemini, and to make everyone feel safe, he was to accompany all of them to the meeting. Piacente, whom Jimmy Sr. trusted, would have claimed heart problems and stayed in bed if he had known what Nino and Roy had in mind when, around 8:30 in the evening, the five men left for the Gemini and Jimmy Jr.'s White Thunderbird. Nino sat in front with Jimmy Jr., Roy and Jimmy Sr. with Piacente between were in the back. Shortly, Jimmy Sr.'s wary antennae detected fatal signals. He told his son to pull off the road so he could respond to an emergency bladder problem. Jimmy Jr. laughed and urged his father to wait until they came upon a gas station. Nino and Roy exchanged wordless, ominous glances. Listen to your father, Jimmy Sr. screamed. Pull over! As Jimmy Jr. slowed to a stop on a service road beside the Belt Parkway, Nino and Roy simultaneously drew their weapons. As Nino fired 3 bullets into Jimmy Jr.'s head, Roy leaned past Piacente and put 4 into Jimmy Sr.'s. Blood splattered in all directions and the driver's window exploded as 1 bullet exited Jimmy Jr.'s brain. The spontaneity of the situation left no time to worry about possible witnesses, such as the 3 people in a car that happened to pass by at that moment. Behind the wheel of his beat-up Buick, 20-year-old Patrick Penny heard what sounded to him like firecrackers going off, then saw the Thunderbird's window burst in flashes of light. 2 female companions implored him to drive on, but Penny stopped some 20 feet past and looked back. I think I just saw someone get shot. A woman, I think. Ordinarily, Penny might have made a perfect see-nothing witness. He was a runty, 110-pound dropout-turned-burglar, in constant trouble with the law and, at the time, was carrying a loaded .25 caliber handgun. However, recently, he had recounted for friends a dream in which he outfoxed a cunning mass murderer and saved the entire city of New York. Against his usual instincts, baby-faced Patrick Penny became civic-minded. Looking back, he saw 3 men leave the Thunderbird. First a slender man, Nino, then two squat ones, Piacente and Roy. As a street lamp lit the scene, it appeared the latter two were stained with blood. One of them wiped his face with a handkerchief and stuck what looked to be a handgun in the belt of his trousers. As Penny watched, the men talked excitedly, then split up. Roy went one way, Nino and Piacente another. Thinking it uncanny how much the scene resembled his heroic dream, and feeling confident because of the loaded pistol in his pocket, Penny decided to follow the two men who walked away together. "Let's get out of here," protested Penny's 19-year-old girlfriend. Undeterred, Penny spotted the two men, Nino and Piacente, a block away. He watched until they turned down another street. "Let's go," yelled the other young woman in Penny's car. "Get the cops." Penny drove in the direction the men had gone, but could not see them. He stopped by a payphone and got out, only to then see them walking along a sidewalk toward him. He bounded back to his car and stood by it as they ambled by, unaware they were giving a witness another close look at themselves. In a few seconds, Penny saw a car service driver stop at a nearby intersection and ran over. "Hey, cabbie, can you get the cops on your two-way radio?" Just as Penny was no ordinary passerby, the driver was no ordinary cabbie. He was Police Sergeant Paul Roeder, a burly, mustachioed 10-year veteran of the NYPD's Housing Authority Division. He was off-duty and moonlighting, without departmental permission, for the pretty darn quick car service. He had just dropped a fare when Penny ran up. Per regulations, he was armed with his service revolver and carrying his badge, and he asked Penny what was wrong. "I just saw two guys kill a girl in a car over there," said Penny, pointing toward the scene. "What guys killed what girl in a car over where?" "Those two guys just killed a girl in a car." Now Penny waved in another direction, to Roeder's left, and to Nino and Piacente proceeding farther down the block. "I'm a policeman. Get in the car." Penny remembered the gun in his pocket. "I ain't getting in your car. I got my own car. I'll follow you." Roeder drifted slowly down the street. 25 feet away, he saw that one of the alleged shooters' jackets appeared dark with blood. They were walking quickly and looking about. Roeder rolled on past at about 10 miles an hour to look at their faces. They looked away and kept walking. On the other side of the next intersection, as Nino and Piacente walked past a gas station, Roeder decided to act. He turned his car diagonally into the curb, jumped out, and stood behind the driver's door with his arms extended, gun in one hand, badge in the other. "Police officer," he shouted, "freeze!" Nino and Piacente were now about 20 feet away, directly in front of two gas pumps. They looked at Roeder like they did not understand him. "Put your hands up," Roeder shouted. Nino calculated the odds against him, one excited cop, and began walking in a circle around Piacente. "Police officer," Roeder shouted again, "put your hands up." Suddenly, from behind Piacente, Nino whirled toward Roeder and fired 3 shots, all errant. Roeder fired 3 in return. One struck Nino in the neck and spun him around. Piacente tried to catch him from falling, but was struck in a leg and began hobbling away. Still much alive, Nino fell face first, his palms outstretched. His pistol landed inches away, and he reached out for it with the fingers of his right hand. Roeder told him to stop, but Nino kept reaching. All he ever wanted, he had always said, was to be like Frank Scalise and die on the street with a pistol in his hand. He had gotten his first wish, and as his fingers now curled around the .38, was on the verge of realizing the second. "Don't touch it or I'll shoot again," Roeder shouted. Nino held onto the pistol, but was too weak to lift his arm. Feeling faint, he let the weapon go, rolled his head sideways, and lay still. For the first time in his life, Anthony Gaggi gave up. At the bunker a half hour later, Nino's 12-year-old son Anthony answered a telephone call from a nurse at Coney Island Hospital, the closest to the scene. Screaming, he ran toward the stairway connecting his and Dominic's and Denise's apartments. "Daddy got shot! Daddy got shot! He's in the hospital!" Dominic raced downstairs as the Gaggi telephone began ringing again. This time it was Roy. After separating from Nino and Piacente, he had seen and heard police cars and ambulances shriek past, and assumed his accomplices had run into trouble and were in custody or dead. He had tossed his weapon down a sewer and called the clubhouse to have someone come fetch him. "Where the f*** were you?" Dominic shouted. "My uncle's been shot. He's at Coney Island now." "Things got fucked. Meet me at the hospital in 10 minutes. Roy junked his bloody clothes, borrowed a fresh outfit from Freddie, and zoomed to the hospital. Meanwhile, Patrick Penny, after hiding his gun in his car's trunk, had accompanied another police officer who had responded to Sergeant Paul Roeder's call for assistance and helped him locate Peter Piacente, whose leg wound had prevented him from hobbling much more than a block away. Like Nino, Piacente was arrested and taken to Coney Island for emergency treatment. Neither man was in danger. The outcome would have been different for Nino if the bullet had struck the stressful vein running down the left side of his neck, rather than a muscled area on his right. Stabilized, he was regaining strength rapidly. When an emergency room physician asked what happened, Nino said, "I was walking in the street and I fucking got shot, that's all." Dr. Umasankar Patti felt the bullet still burrowed beneath Nino's flesh, then said, "Don't worry, it's superficial." Dominic did not know the wound was superficial. He arrived at the hospital thinking the worst, and that relative to death, even the most serious of his grievances against Nino seemed pathetically petty. He marched past police officers into the emergency room, saw Nino was conscious, but before reaching his bedside, was escorted into a waiting room by officers who said the patient would be all right but was under arrest. Roy then arrived, saying he was Nino's brother. He also attempted to speak to him, but also was rebuffed. Outside the hospital with Dominic, he tried to explain what happened. The adrenaline in Dominic's stomach turned to poison. His words were fast, deliberate, and contemptuous. "You left him in a bad spot again, just like with fucking Governara. How come you weren't there? You left him with a fucking old coot. You're one fucking fearless guy, Rooster." The words hit like a dagger, but Roy let them pass through. "We had to split. It was Nino's idea. We have other things to worry about now. I've got to see Paul. I've got to tell him what happened first, because he ain't going to like how we used Pete to set them up." Dominic then went with Roy to Paul's house on Staten Island. Beforehand, they picked up Thomas Bellotti, the Staten Island capo who had accompanied Paul to Nino's house the night Paul was made boss. Since then, Bellotti, a power in the white-collar, labor-manipulating rackets Paul preferred, had almost supplanted Nino in importance because Nino had become so content to hang out in Florida and count his money that he was caring less if someone else got Paul's ear. At Paul's house, Bellotti told Dominic to wait in the car while he and Roy spoke to Paul. When they returned, Dominic asked Bellotti, "What does Paulie want me to do?" "For now, we just go home and wait." Roy was not the waiting type, and he immediately began thinking of ways to help out Nino, who in hours would be formally accused of murder, attempted murder, and other charges. So would the deceived Peter Piacente. But Roy and no one but personal family members would give Piacente a thought, so long as he stood up, of course. The next day, Roy and Dominic met at the Gemini. Dominic, so familiar with the signs, thought Roy was so badly hungover that he must have been up all night drinking while thinking. Some of the ideas he began to spew were half-baked, but he also had solid information. From Nino's lawyers, he had already learned that the witnesses in the case were Patrick Penny and Paul Roeder. Penny, he said, was bribable. "We give him 50 grand, he'll take it, but Roeder might have to die." He also had already discovered that Roeder lived in Flatlands, not far from the Gemini. Unlike most officers, Roeder kept his name listed in the telephone directory. "He practically lives around the corner," Roy said. "We'll just wait outside his house and pop him." "You're losing it, Roy. You don't know what heat is until you kill a cop. You kill a cop, Nino will kill you. Your uncle just tried it, and don't talk to me about heat. That was different. That wasn't an assassination." Roy barely skipped a beat to his next idea. Pending a hearing on a request for bail, Nino had already been transferred to the prison hospital of Rikers Island, a tiny isle in the East River where the city housed most pretrial detainees. "Here's how we bust him out," Roy said. "We'll get some scuba gear and sneak up on Rikers and take the hospital with machine guns." "That's the stupidest James Bond bullshit I ever heard. If you ever tried a stunt like that, I guarantee it, my uncle would not leave with you. He'd shoot you if he could." Finally, Roy came up with an idea Dominic found reasonable. Actually, the more he considered it, the idea seemed positively ingenious. On his lawyer's advice, Nino had refused to let doctors extract the bullet that Paul Roeder had fired into his neck. In time, the healing process would push it to the surface anyway. If in the meantime, however, another bullet was smuggled into Nino, one that ballistics tests would show was fired by a gun other than Roeder's, and Nino could substitute it for the one that would finally pop out of his neck, then, at trial, his lawyers could argue this fantastic but reasonably plausible scenario. Nino was wounded by the same gunman who had escaped after shooting both Jimmy Jr. and Jimmy Sr. Exiting the car, the gunman dropped one of his two weapons. Hard luck Nino grabbed it when he fled on foot, and then pulled it in self-defense when someone who never identified himself as a cop began firing at him. "A long shot, but I like it," Dominic said. "Only one juror has to buy it." The plan required retrieval of the gun Roy had tossed in the sewer as he left the scene. So that night, while Dominic, Henry, and Joey stood guard, Roy removed a grating and climbed down into the muck near Bath Beach and recovered the Danny Grillo-type .38 caliber Smith & Wesson he had used. At the Gemini, Roy dipped the weapon into an oil drum filled with water and fired one round, which he then fished out. "Now it's your job to smuggle it in," Roy said, handing over the ballistically correct bullet. On October 8th, Rose Gaji, who was never told about the plot, and Dominic visited Nino in his guarded room at the Rikers Island Infirmary. Fearful of metal detectors, Dominic had wrapped the bullet in a condom and concealed it in his mouth. As the visit ended, he coughed into his right hand, then shook Nino's and kissed him on the cheek, Sicilian to Sicilian. That night, Nino lay awake, hastening nature by gouging at his neck with his fingernails. When the rotor-fired bullet popped out, he flushed it down a toilet. The next day he gave the smuggled-in round to a corrections officer, who gave the manufactured evidence to police. The fix was on. With 2 potential 25-year-to-life prison terms to worry about, however, Nino was not going to rely only on the bullet switch. He instructed Roy to begin working on another plan, bribing Patrick Penny and/or Paul Roeder to forget or alter what they saw and said in the immediate aftermath of the killings. Penny was targeted first. He was more crucial because he could testify he saw Nino leave the Thunderbird just after the Ippolitos were shot. Penny, however, was proving hard to track down at the moment. Even the police did not know where he was. After the shooting, detectives had stashed Penny in a motel to make certain he testified before a grand jury and helped the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office obtain indictments of Nino and Piacente. Afterward, they sought to keep him in protective custody to make sure he stayed alive to testify at trial. But Penny reverted to his antisocial habits and decided he did not want to hang out with police anymore. When detectives escorted him home for fresh clothes, the wiry little burglar went to the bathroom, climbed out a window, and ran away. Believing Penny would stay in contact with his family, Nino and Roy decided to send him a message to his brother Robert. They dispatched Dominic and Henry and Joey and Anthony to the gas station where Robert worked. Nino paternally told Dominic to go in disguise. The others did not bother. Joey, Roy's new right hand, did the talking. "Your brother is fucking with the wrong people. He saw what happened to the 2 guys in the car. If he testifies, it'll happen to him. Tell him to do the right thing. We'll give $50,000 up front and take care of him the rest of his life." "I think he'll go along," Robert replied. "He'd better," the other Gemini twin said. Roy's hyperactive imagination in the days following the Ippolito murders was also due to the unresolved threat he felt from the Jordanian car exporter, Khaled Fad Darwish Daoud. Daoud was still perturbed that car thieves he believed were led by seemingly mild-mannered Ronald Ustica were giving his estranged partner in Kuwait, Abdullah Hassan, a distinct competitive advantage. Unaware the crew had already abandoned one plan to kill him, because Richie Denomi accidentally shot himself in the hand, Daoud had continued grumbling about Ustica and the shortage of Chevrolet Caprices at the used car auctions in New Jersey. As yet, however, he had not carried out his vow to contact police. In the months since the plan was aborted, the stakes had increased. In Kuwait, Abdullah Hassan was ecstatic with the way the car deal was unfolding and had ordered more rentals, as Ustica referred to the stolen cars. To handle the request, Roy moved the operation out of Freddie's 4-car garage and into a former milk company warehouse where 20 cars at a time were re-tagged. In Baldwin, Long Island now, cars ready for shipment were stored in a warehouse Hassan had bought for Ustica, rather than parked on the streets near Ustica's home. The 5 active partners in the car deal and the inactive tandem of Nino and Paul were now making up to $20,000 a week each. The profits were so outrageous, even Vito Arena, who got $100 for every car he helped steal, rather than a full partner share, was spending $1,300 a week just on food. In the giddy dinners at the Gemini Clubhouse before the Ippolito murders, Roy had discussed expanding the operation further, and then leveling off at 100 cars per week, or, based on the $5,000 Hassan paid for each car, some $83,000 a week per partnership. "No use getting greedy," Roy said to a lot of happy hooting. In such an avaricious atmosphere, no matter if he never contacted police, Khaled Daoud likely was doomed. But on October 10th, 2 days after Dominic's smuggling trip to Rikers, Roy learned that Daoud had blindly called police and had been told to write a letter outlining his allegations. One more time, Detective Peter Calabro of the Auto Crime Unit provided the tip. Unusually, because it was Wednesday, Dominic happened to be at the clubhouse that night, updating the Eppolito situation with Roy, when Roy's principal Hook came by. As ever, Calabro and Roy talked out of earshot of anyone else, this time in a hallway. "A lot of guys have got clipped because of that guy," Roy appreciatively said to Dominic after Calabro left. Because Roy had not discussed Daoud with him, Dominic did not understand the remark's specific implication, only that someone was about to die. He went home depressed, and not because of any cocaine letdown. Here Nino was in jail for a double homicide, and Roy was out planning another killing. The murders just never stopped. Roy had recently bragged of being up to 100 notches and counting. Was he going for 1,000? Dominic left and let the Gemini cabal hatch a plan for whoever it was they were set to kill. With all of Roy's experience, a plan was quickly hatched. And because Daoud was in the market for cars, he decided to lure him to Freddie's engine shop, not the clubhouse. This was not a big step for Freddie to take, because he had always said he would do anything for Roy. At an auction in New Jersey the next day, Ronald Ustica arranged for a friend to tell Daoud that a man named Freddie DeMeo, who happened to be at the auction, had two hard-to-find Caprices for sale at his garage in Brooklyn. Daoud sought out Freddie, who invited him to inspect the cars the following day. That evening, the setup took on a surprise dimension when Daoud telephoned to say he would be coming with a friend. At a strategy council, Freddie wondered what to do. "It was a silly question," Roy said. "We just shoot them both and make them disappear," he added. "Disappear?" asked Vito Arena, familiar with the crew's methods, but not its nomenclature. "Cut them up." The friend of Daoud's who wandered into this void was Ronald Falcaro, another Long Island used car dealer who had been assisting Daoud in his efforts to purchase cars legitimately. Leaving home on the morning of October 12th, Falcaro, the father of 3 children, told his wife Donna he had business with his new associate, Khaled Daoud, but would be home in the afternoon to help her prepare for a birthday party for their youngest child. For his second double homicide in 11 days, Roy arrived at Freddie's shop an hour before the scheduled meeting. The rest arrived within minutes. This time, Roy had distributed clean silencer-equipped weapons beforehand, which he and Dirty Henry began checking and rechecking. The Gemini twins removed a vinyl pool liner and their toolkits from their car trunks and carted everything inside. Although not partners in the car deal, they were helping out as a favor to me, Roy said to Vito. With Roy directing, they passed the time rehearsing. A car with its hood up was parked nearly against the door of Freddie's shop. Vito Arena would pretend he was working on the engine and make sure no one not supposed to exited the shop, a windowless building that could be lighted only via a power cord strung from an adjacent building. Roy, Henry, and Joey, and Anthony would hide in the darkness and do the work when Freddie led the victims inside. To limit the number of bullets flying around, Roy would take one victim, Henry, his prized stone-cold shooter, the other, with the twins on standby. Everyone was in position when Falcaro and Daoud arrived on schedule. Freddie led them straight past Vito to the door of the shop and waved them in ahead. "Christ, your electricity get cut off," Falcaro said as he stepped into a trap darker than death. "Fuck, I forgot the lights," Freddie said, so fast that he was able to turn and leave the shop before the victims had any hint of doom, which suddenly announced itself in a series of muffled popping sounds. Daoud went down quickly. Although wounded, Falcaro ran for the door. He pushed against it as Henry kept firing at him, and actually got a single hand around the outside edge, but heavyweight Vito was on the other side. He grunted, pressed against the door, and fed Falcaro to the sharks. After Freddie turned the lights on, and after Roy said it was okay to come in, Vito saw Henry pump be sure shots into Daoud's head, and Roy leaning over Falcaro and deciding nothing more was required there. "Got a little hairy there for a bit," Roy said. "That one guy didn't want to go down." "Piece of cake, Roy," Henry said. Joey and Anthony laid out the pool liner and the knives from their toolkits. Freddie brought in garbage bags and several heavy cardboard boxes the crew used to transport its smut films. "We've got about 45 minutes to kill," Roy said to Vito. "Why don't you and Henry go get some hot dogs and pizza?" The next day, the boxes would be taken to Richie Denomi's nearby body shop, where Anthony Center's uncle's sanitation company, a client of the Fountain Avenue dump, picked up the garbage. In a few hours, everyone reassembled at the Gemini for the regular Friday evening shape-up. Making his pickup for Nino, Dominic arrived later on and noticed that everyone seemed unusually euphoric. Vito said he and the boys were all on a high. Dominic thought they had just killed someone in the clubhouse. Weary of the crew's relentless killing, Dominic finally verbalized his contempt. "Who checked into the Horror Hotel tonight?" he said sarcastically. "Who didn't check out, a baby?" Everyone laughed and thought he was only making a joke. He left and felt like never coming back. Roy ordered Henry and Vito to go ransack the Arab's hotel room and collect his personal belongings. Freddie had removed the room key from Daoud's trousers. Roy said, "Bring back everything. We want to make it look like he left town. This way the cops will blame him for the other guy's disappearance." Although familiar with the Gemini method because of the two naked corpses he saw in the clubhouse bathroom one day, Vito was still taken aback by the afternoon's first-hand illustration. En route to the hotel with Henry, he asked, "Do you always cut him into pieces like that?" "No, but we've done it several times. Not me personally. It just depends. Sometimes you want them to be found. Sometimes it's better if they're missing." Henry asked Vito if he had any qualms, and Vito said no. "Well, don't worry about anything. You're with good people. Roy is good people. He looks out for his people." Henry continued to ramble on about Roy, then mentioned some of the crew's more notorious murders: Andre Katz, Sheree Golden, Chris Rosenberg, especially Chris. As he summed up Joey Testa's role in that murder, there was a bitter edge in his voice that Vito mistook for mere irony. "Joey's very good. He even went to ID the body, and he cried. Joey's the best." Back at the Horror Hotel, Henry and Vito helped Roy inventory Daoud's suitcases. They found Statue of Liberty and Empire State Building souvenirs, family photos, business papers, and a typed letter addressed to various authorities, alleging that a gang of thieves was shipping stolen cars to Kuwait. "We got him just in time," Roy smiled. "Ain't no more problem with the Arab." The next day, after reporting to police that her husband was missing, a panicky Donna Falcaro discovered that Daoud, whom she had met, had apparently checked out of his room. Because her husband was in the car business, Nassau Auto Squad officer Charles Meade was among those sent to interview her. "I don't know much about what he does, but I'm really upset," she said. "All I know is he was meeting some people in Canarsie or someplace." Not wanting to upset her further, Meade did not give any indication, when he heard the word Canarsie, that he was certain her husband was dead. On her own, Donna Falcaro contacted people she knew her husband had done business with, such as Ronald Ustica. Summoning his best Joey Testa imitation, Ustica appeared to be sympathetic and concerned, and offered this advice: "If I was you, I'd tell your husband not to hang around with that Arab because he's bad news." The case was assigned to Nassau Missing Persons Detective Bill O'Loughlin. He interviewed Ustica, but Ustica played dumb, naturally well. As so many times before, the case went nowhere. The contempt for Roy and the crew that Dominic began to express during the Ippolito drama, his calling Roy "Rooster" to his face, his sarcastic jab at the clerks of the Horror Hotel, did not spring up overnight, of course. The root went back to the time the crew equated Henry's aversion to butchery with cowardice. It grew when they made Danny Grillo disappear, and when Roy, in a fanatic panic, killed a young vacuum cleaner salesman. Associating with such people, and with his own considerable degeneracy, Dominic was not very entitled to claim to be holier than thou, but he felt that way nonetheless. He was also depressed and anxious, and in the middle of a personal crisis from which he saw no way out. It began months earlier, soon after his do-or-die diplomacy in the Cuban crisis. One of his favorite haunts was still the Pear Tree, the Manhattan bistro where he and Henry began meeting years before. The Pear Tree usually contained some interesting people. Dominic had met Nino's old childhood pal, former middleweight boxing champ Jake LaMotta there, and also the writer Truman Capote, to whom he had introduced himself as Dominic Santa Maria, a name he sometimes traveled by now, an alias, but not really, and therefore another neat Sicilian trick. At the Pear Tree one evening, Henry brought the news that set Dominic off on another binge. Even though Dominic did not feel close to Henry anymore, because Henry had shown in the wake of Danny Grillo's murder that he believed Dominic had been dispatched to kill him, they still got together. Henry, as always, kept him posted on crew events and politics. Henry had just begun making easy money in the car deal, but was still disappointed that Roy had picked Joey to be his second-in-command. "That slot ought to be mine," he whined. "Well, why don't you just whack them both?" Dominic joked. "Very funny. Even if I wanted to, Roy is a man who can't be killed. I don't know what it is, a sixth sense or something, radar. He just wouldn't let you get him." "I think Roy thinks the same thing about Nino. Nino's the only guy he's afraid of. Nino would smell you coming and shoot you first. That's what keeps them from ever turning on each other. It's a wonderful life." I just felt I was entitled to the job. You know how much work I've done? I can imagine. The job should have been yours, but the rooster thinks you're too friendly with me. Joey's his dog. He knows Joey hates me because Chris hated me. Joey won't spill anything to me, which means he doesn't have to worry about Nino as much. I was there before fucking Joey. It's just the way things are. It's the rooster's crew. My uncle would never get involved in it if that's what you're driving at. Speaking of Nino, you know that thing with the Cubans? Your uncle got 150 grand off the top of that. What? Yep, Roy gave him 150 of what they made on that. Dominic began to boil as he listened to Henry describe how Roy, Joey, and Anthony had sold most of the stolen 12 kilos in lucrative chunks and given Nino maybe the biggest one. In an enraged whisper, he fumed. The fucking rooster never said thanks for how I got him out of that situation, and my uncle hollered at me for expecting any. Those fucks.